Okay. All right. So thank you, Andrea, for inviting me here. I'm so excited to be here in front of everybody. This is a topic that I really, really enjoy talking about. A, because I love gardening, and B, because I also like promoting healthy eating. So it works really well for my career. But yeah, so like Andrea said, I'm a registered dietitian, nutritionist. So what that means is I have a bachelor's of science from a 4-year school, and then you have to do like 1,000 hours of supervised practice and then take a national exam. And then once you complete all that, then you can get licensed in your individual states. But yeah, so I've been doing this for, I think, about 9 years, mostly either in hospitals, long-term care facilities, LTACs, and just about everywhere in between. But yeah, so that's a little bit about me. But I wanted to get kind of a baseline about you guys. So for starters, how many of you have gardens at home? Okay, good. Do you guys do like a garden bed or like a raised bed or pots, or what kind of things are you working with? You can shout them out. Raised beds? Okay. What was that? Garden beds? Okay, just some big beds? Yeah. Nice. Good. And how many of you have experimented with growing herbs in those beds? Or are you guys all vegetables and fruit trees? No, nobody experiments with herbs? And pots, yep. Herbs are like very, very friendly for pot gardening, so that's great. All right. Well, today we'll kind of talk about all the different options for herbs, but we'll also kind of talk about not only the growing side of herbs and what to think about even before you start growing them, but also how to use those, so that way you're not wasting it, because nothing's worse than starting a garden, paying for it, investing all your time into it, and then getting a produce that you end up not using and having to just throw in the compost bin later on. But yeah. All right. See if the clicker works. Perfect. Okay, so first of all, I just wanted to make sure you guys know, I put this quote up here, but basically herbs have been around for a very, very long time. If you think back in the Marco Polo stories or days, they always talked about trading things. And so herbs were money, essentially. They were medicine, they were money. There was a lot of value between different herbs. And even now, like if you look at saffron or vanilla beans, these things cost a good bit of money still at the grocery store. I think recently I was at Publix and they had one vanilla bean for about $9 in a jar. But yeah, so it can be expensive, and getting like really good saffron is also really hard. So it's just, some of these take a lot of time to grow, and a lot of effort goes into those and harvesting them at the specific time. So they're still worth a lot of money today. But luckily, a lot of them are accessible for all of us, so we can easily grow them at home. So for starters, I just want to talk a little bit about, when I say herbs, what do I mean? What is an herb? So when I talk about herbs, I'm talking about most of the time the green part of the plant, so the leafy part. And I have some of them that I'll pass around in a little bit, if I can walk away from the microphone. But so you have herbs from your plants, and then you also have spices. So most people see them as two separate groups. So spices are going to be like the seeds from that plant, or the root, or the bark. So it's still a part of the plant, but it's just not the leafy green part that we typically think of when we think of herbs. And then the last category, I always say it wrong, but I believe it's allium. Is that right? Perfect, thank you. Okay, so that'd be, like, in my mind, that's where my onion type plants come from. So that's going to be your garlic, your chives, which kind of fall into the herbs groups, and then onions and leeks all fall in that allium group. And fun fact about that group is the entire plant of all of those plants is edible. The bulb, the stalk, the roots, every part of an allium plant is edible in some way or form or fashion. So good to know if you have some of those at home, you can use the whole thing. But yeah. Oops. All right. So when you're planting a garden, you really want to start before you even buy your plants. You want to already be planning and thinking, what am I buying? What am I using it for? What do I need? So one thing to keep in mind is your food preferences. So a good example is cilantro. How many of you hate cilantro? Cilantro? I think I have.
C or S?
C. Yep. Cilantro. And I have one I'll pass around so you guys can see it. But cilantro, some people hate cilantro. And it's not just like oh, it doesn't taste good to me. It's a genetic thing where if they eat a cilantro leaf, it will taste like soap. Like just a bar of soap on your tongue. Yeah, so it all goes back to their genes. So some people just genetically will not like cilantro. And then an example for me is I don't like licorice. So I like basil plants, but Thai basil has like a very distinct licorice taste. So for me, I'm never going to plant that because I know I'm never going to use that. But yeah, so something to keep in mind always is what are your food preferences or your family's food preferences. We were talking about okra over here, and you would hate to grow like tons of okra and then have nothing to do with it and not be able to eat it or freeze it fast enough. So just kind of knowing about how much you'll go through or having a backup plan for if you're not going to use it right away when it's fresh, are you going to can it, freeze it, dry it? What's the plan for those? Another thing to consider after food preferences is do you want like an annual plant or a perennial plant? And so I included in this handout that I think all of you should have. If not, there's more copies in the back. So I listed the annuals, the perennials, and then the evergreen perennial herbs. So this is just good to kind of have them in your head so you know what's what without having to look them up. But the annual herbs are great for those pot gardens. So basically, you know, every year you might want to switch it up, or if you're doing like a flower bed where you know you're going to have your annual flowers, if you want to throw in some annual herbs, throw them into that bed. You don't want to throw in a perennial herb into your annual flower beds because that's going to cause some issues eventually. But yeah, and then same thing with perennial herbs, keeping in mind what beds you want those in, or if it's a pot, is there a way you can kind of overwinter that pot so that the roots won't freeze during the winter? And then lastly, the evergreen perennials. I put those on there just so you'll know if you're like putting them in your landscaping, what's going to be evergreen for the whole year. So like a good example would be, how many of you have ate in that little area outside of the cafeteria? Where there's like 5 or 6 different picnic tables or round tables out there. Okay, and there's all these flower beds around it. Well, if you look, the corners right next to where that waterfall is, there's 2 big bushes, and those are both rosemary bushes. So it's an evergreen perennial that you can keep out all year, year after year, until it starts to look bad. And then you can keep using it too, so keep cutting off of it. But yeah.
I don't see sage on it.
You don't see sage. I don't think I added sage.
I'm thinking I grew one.
Have it under Mexican.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, so further down on the handout, I also sorted the herbs by the country. So if you're making a dish, you can think like, well, if I'm doing some Mexican cuisine or French cuisine, these are the herbs that those cuisines tend to fall to. So if you have a recipe that only has like, say you're doing Spanish recipe and it has parsley in it, but you have rosemary and garlic and other stuff, you can add those and they should do well with that dish. But I want to say, this is my first year growing sage, but it looks pretty good still.
I think I have
It's overwinters?
some in the garden.
It's a perennial, okay.
Amongst my other garden bushes.
Yeah.
And I like the smell of it,
Oh, the smell, yeah, oh yeah, definitely.
but it got huge.
Yeah, it'll grow big, yeah. So that's one thing to keep in mind with all the herbs is sometimes they're really hard to control, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, but she said that sage is a perennial, so it should come back. Do you know if it stays evergreen or not?
I don't know.
Okay.
The reason I remember the spring was it's really hard to get rid of once it's
Yeah.
seeded, it's hard to get rid of.
Okay, perfect. She said it's really hard to get rid of once it's rooted. It's going to stay there. But yeah, and then another thing you want to keep in mind is the size and the shape. So when you're looking at an area that you want to plant things in, you want to think of what is this plant going to grow up to look like. So for instance, for rosemary, there's the rosemary out there that we have that grows in a nice bush. But if you had like say a wall along part of your garden, there's another variety of rosemary that kind of crawls and will kind of like waterfall off the side of that wall. So thinking about what you're looking for in a plant too will help with making decisions on what plants you're going to want to buy. And then we were just talking about the sage. So the next one I want to talk about with invasiveness. Can any of you tell me any herbs that you've tried in the past that you just like, once you wanted to get rid of them, they said no?
Mint?
Mint, yes, mint is a very popular one. Chives, oh yeah, chives will hang around. Yeah, somebody mentioned cilantro earlier today, which I always kill, so I was amazed that they had problems getting rid of it. But yeah, and then sage was mentioned. So that's something to keep in mind too. So I enjoy eating mint, especially with desserts, but I don't ever put mint in the ground at my house because I don't want it growing up in the yard and other areas. And I know I've heard people say if you can plant things in like, say, like a coffee container, like a metal coffee container, and just poke a couple holes, that way the roots are kind of contained. But those roots can get out of those little holes and then it's no longer contained. So for things like cilantro and mint and chives, I tend to keep those in pots on my deck or my balcony, just because they're easy to contain. I don't have to worry about them. And I've have a few that will come back the next year as long as the roots don't freeze over the winter. But yeah, so that's something to keep in mind too. Another thing is whether you're going to start your plants from seed or from a starter plant. Have any of you tried different things from seeds before? Just a few? Nice. It is a little bit more challenging, and you might not have the same success rates. So I do tell people, if you're new to starting out with gardens, don't start with seeds because you might get kind of tired of it and lose interest. But if you do want to do seeds, just kind of keep in mind how long it takes for them to germinate, and then if you're going to need like growing lights and the temperature requirements and stuff like that. But it can be done. It's just a little bit harder sometimes from seeds. And then the last but not least, bugs is a great thing to consider. And the good thing about most herbs is that they're very fragrant, and bugs don't like that. So most herbs won't have too much bug problems, but I did put at the bottom of this handout, the first page, some information on companion planting. So which herbs go with other herbs or with other vegetables to kind of help with those pests that we don't like different bugs and worms. So feel free to pair some of those too. But yeah, and has anybody done citronella plants before? What was that? Thought about? Yeah, yeah. After you get bit so many times by mosquitoes, I think everybody thinks about buying them. Yeah, so some people will buy citronella plants and then just put them out on their deck or on a patio, and that way, if they're sitting out there, they can just kind of rub the leaves on them, and then you'll smell like you just sprayed yourself with citronella, or like a citronella candle is lit next to you. I still think it just depends on how much the mosquitoes like you, though. Any questions so far? All right. Well, now we'll get into the actual planting. So you've picked out what herbs you want. You got some ideas for where you want them, what you're going to do with them. So now you've got to actually plant them in the ground and keep them alive. So one rule of thumb for most herbs, and definitely most garden plants in general, is that they all like 6 hours of sunlight. So if we can get them that, we try to get them that. And most plants in general like morning sunlight, something that's going to dry them out right away in the morning so they don't have that mildew sitting on them all morning, potentially causing like viruses and funguses. But yeah, so 6 hours of light, preferably in the morning, but if not, a lot of these herbs are going to be your hardy ones that can stand up to different hours of wetness, I guess. But yeah, another thing to keep in mind is well-draining soil. I'm originally from Ohio. I don't know if you guys could tell or not. And when I moved to South Carolina, it was a little bit of a shell shock. I went from like very, very rich, dark soil to the South Carolina clay, and had to adjust a little bit what I was doing. So keep in mind that your herbs do like well-drained, kind of loomy soil, so you might have to supplement that soil at first, especially if you're going straight into the ground and it's all clay. Another thing they like is that organic matter. So just like all of you need nutrition to stay healthy every day, your plants need that nutrition too. So making sure they have some kind of organic matter, some kind of like compost, manure, that kind of stuff. And they're not most plants aren't very picky. It's more just what do you want to put on it. So some people, if they're eating organic, they'll want an organic compost. But it's just kind of whatever you prefer. Yeah. I included the pH. Most herbs prefer the 6 to 6.5 pH. Do any of you know the pH of your soil? What was that? Yeah. So they do. You can get soil tests done through the extension office. I'm not gonna lie, I've never gotten it done for herbs before. If I'm like investing in some berry bushes and like some bigger things, I'll do it, but not so much for herbs because I can just toss them out and buy another one for $3. But there is ways to get soil tests done if you're interested in learning the pH, or you can buy like little home kits at the Home and Garden. Any big box store will have like little home kits where you can test it on your own. And then another thing to keep in mind is when you're planting them. So like your annuals, just like your flower annuals, you're going to plant your annual herbs in the spring, and they'll be everywhere at the store. But for like the woody herbs, like especially the perennials, if you plant those in the spring, then they got to adjust over the summer and kind of get used to it. And the summer is the toughest in the South. I mean, in this state, if you're a plant, summer is kind of the make or break season for you. So if I'm planting, say, like a rosemary or like a sage or something that I want to come back year after year, I'll wait till the fall to do that one. So that way it's past those summer months and it can get like kind of acclimated for a few months in the fall, and then I just have to protect it a little bit over winter if it gets really cold. But it's easier to protect plants like perennials in the winter than it is in the summer, typically. So same thing with like trees or like our berry bushes, in our perennials, like our azaleas and stuff. We just planted all that recently in the last few months, and we didn't do anything over summer, just because I knew chances are it would die during summer. But yeah. And then last thing with planting is the root flare. Are all of you familiar with what the root flare is? No. Okay, so the root flare is when you're looking at like the stalk of, say, a tree is a good example, and you'll have that first root that comes off. That's the root flare. So that's where your roots are actually starting, and you want that to be exposed. You want to be able to look down and still see that when you're looking at it once it's planted. If that root flare is buried, then all of the roots are buried and they're probably going to be too deep. So you always want to err on the side of caution and keep that root flare up and in the air, kind of, as opposed to too deep. But yeah. And that's the same for all perennials and stuff.
Is that just one root?
Yeah, at least one. Yeah, you don't have to have like a bunch of them where you can see them, but just that one, that initial root flare, you want it to be right there. And so that way that plant knows exactly where dirt is and where air is. And so you'll be less risk of like damaging the roots long term. But yeah. And then once you've got everything planted, then you just need to maintain it, which is also a hard part if you're like me and you get tired of watering things. So the biggest thing is to water it regularly. If it's a pot in the summer, it's probably going to need watered maybe every day, just because it gets so hot and dry. If it's in ground, you can protect it a little bit more, and you might be able to get away with watering it every few days. But for the perennial herbs, like the rosemary type herbs, for those, your goal is to start after the initial week. You want to start kind of tapering off on the water. So if you water a plant every day, then the roots are only going to grow in that watered area. Where if you were to water a plant, say really, really deeply every 3 days, then the roots are more likely to grow out, which is what you want, because you want them to have to start to work for their nutrition and their water. Yeah, and then mulching helps as well. So especially in the South, I mulch everything herb-wise. So even if I do like herbs in a pot, I'll put mulch on top of that pot just to kind of help it retain that moisture during the day so it doesn't dry out as much. And then it also helps with weeds. We were talking about weeds earlier. If you're doing herbs in a bed, the mulch will definitely cut down on how much time you're weeding during the summer. Any questions on that? Yeah.
Are you talking about containers or are you talking about putting in the ground?
Yeah, that's a good question. So she asked when I mentioned like watering after, you plant something and you water it every day at first, and then you're trying to get away from it. She asked, is that for in ground or in containers? It would be for in ground.
Okay, because the reason I thought about that, did you say this causes, if you do it every few days, it causes the moisture to spread? As
Yeah. Yeah, so most plants, they're going to spread out. Unless you're talking like a tree with a taproot, roots are all going to spread out. They're not going to ever go that deep. They don't really want to most of the time. So the more often, like when I started gardening, for instance, I would go out with the hose every morning or every afternoon, which is even worse. And I'd just kind of sprinkle it for like 5 minutes with the hose, and then I'd kind of walk away. And then the next day I'd come back out again and kind of sprinkle it with the hose. And so what I basically taught was for all those roots to stay right at the surface level and know that they're going to get watered every day, which is great. But then if I skipped a day or two, those plants were not happy and they did not look pretty. So the goal is once you get it kind of established after the first week or two, to kind of start watering it less and less often, but you want to use more water at a time. So think about it, if it rained for like 3 hours, just a steady downpour at your house. That's what you're kind of looking for every few days. So that's where people, if you're really serious about it, will get like the soaker hoses. So you could turn them on for, say, like 6 hours every 3 days. And yeah, but it's just kind of seeping out. So it's not like it's like pouring out like a hose, it's just kind of seeping. So your water bill won't shoot up too much. But yeah, so that teaches the plant, especially if it's going to be like a tree or a perennial that you want to, like in your landscaping, you want to teach the roots to go out and kind of get out of their little hole. And so that's the best way, is to kind of challenge them and make them work for that nutrition and for the water. Yeah. So now, if you heard all that information, you're like, oh, I got that. Like, I already do all that. I'm on to the next thing. I have something that might be a good challenge for you. So this is a knot garden. So if you're looking for a really, really good challenge, these are basically gardens that, as you can see, it's like one continuous shrub, and it's basically like a knot. If you were to take string, if there's a knot at the end of the day, and you could stretch it all out if you wanted to. But people will prune their gardens to look like these knot gardens, but it might be like thyme or mint or something like that. Yeah. Any takers?
That's all one shrub?
Yep, that's all one shrub, just like woven and
It had
knotted.
to take many years.
Yeah, I would think so, and a lot of trimming. A lot of trimming.
They have those a lot over in England and other
Okay, that might be where this picture is from. But yeah, all right. So after you've kind of successfully grown and maintained this herb, then it comes to the fun part. You get to harvest the herbs. And so there's lots of different ways to do this, which is good because you can kind of do it based off of what you want to use it for and what you have time to do. So fresh is definitely my favorite way to pick herbs. So especially if I keep like a bunch of pots of different herbs on the balcony, every night or when I'm making breakfast or making a lunch, I can run out there and snip a little bit off and add it to something. So for instance, if I'm making eggs, I always run out and get like some thyme and some oregano and just throw them in the eggs just for some extra flavor. And I'm always impressed by if you take your like little spice container of thyme versus fresh thyme right off the plant. There's a huge taste difference. It's kind of like crazy how much you'll taste it more if it's fresh. Like I didn't even know I liked oregano. I've been using oregano, like the little spice container, for years, and I just kind of don't taste it very much. But then I started using the fresh oregano right off the plant, and now I'm like, okay, now I recognize that taste and I know what it tastes like now. But yeah, so fresh is definitely convenient, especially if you're looking to cook on the go. And then you can also do dried. Has anybody tried drying herbs out? Okay. I would say probably the most popular one is lavender. You'll see like clumps of lavender hanging. And I think that's what's in the picture here. But yeah, so when you're drying herbs, the biggest thing is thinking about when you're going to cut them. So a lot of people will cut them first thing in the morning before the sun kind of dehydrates the plant a little bit for the day. So they'll cut it in the morning and then just hang it in a dry place. Some people will put them in a food dehydrator. Some people put them in the oven on like 200, just a really low temperature. So it kind of works for whatever works for you will work for the plant most of the time, as long as you don't burn it. But yeah, so I just take them and dry them. I just tie them with a little string and then hang them from somewhere like in a closet or somewhere like away from moisture. So you wouldn't want to do like hanging it in your kitchen or in a bathroom or anything like that. You want it to be a more dry place. But just like you would if you were drying out flowers. Yeah. And then another option is to freeze the herbs. So there's lots of options. Some people will just freeze them in water. Some people will freeze them in oil. Some people just take the herb right off the leaf and put it in a mason jar and freeze it. if you're freezing it in like oil or water, some people will put it in like ice cube trays. That way you can put all the ice cubes in a little bag, and then every day if you need, like, say you're making some pasta sauce and you want some oregano and thyme and rosemary and olive oil, you can have one pre-made and just pop it in your pan. But yeah, so it's kind of like the sky's the limit for that one. You can kind of do whatever works for you and whatever you plan on using it for. And then infusing things is another kind of, I would say, growing trend with herbs, especially as people start to use more of the infused oils, kind of like the food infusers. Is that what they're called? Yeah. Okay. But yeah, so olive oils are great. If you have like a container of olive oil, you can stick like some rosemary or whatever flavor you like. I mean, honestly, they sell any combination you can find. Oils are a big one, and then also, I don't know if any of you guys do liquor drinks, but some people will put like mint in vodka or something to infuse like a fancy liquor drink and have more flavor there too. But yeah. And another growing thing is tea gardens. Has anyone heard of a tea garden or done a tea garden before?
I've heard of it.
You've heard of it? Okay. Yeah. So basically, if you like drinking tea, people have started making herb gardens based on what they want to drink. So they'll plant, say, some lavender and lemon balm and rose hips all in like little pots on their garden, and then they can dry it out and then make their own tea combinations. But yeah. All right. Okay. So now is the fun part, cooking actually in the kitchen. So as a dietitian, I love herbs because it adds so much flavor to your food, but also it means you'll use less of other things for your food. So the thing I specifically hit on a lot is sodium. Have any of you been mentioned or told that like you maybe should avoid some salt and keep the salt on the low end? I see a few hands. Yeah, so most people in the United States, if we're eating any kind of processed food at all or anything convenient, we're probably getting too much salt. So herbs are a great way to kind of get flavor from different herbs that are healthy for us, but also will cover up the fact that that salt's not there or there's not as much of it. So when you're doing herbs in the kitchen, things to keep in mind are the taste. You know, if you're doing Italian, are you using the Italian herbs? If you're doing the Mexican, are you doing Mexican herbs? So what taste would go along with it? And then also the flavor of those herbs. So a lot of times when you think of a recipe, if you're thinking, you know, oh, I want to add something spicy, you have your go-to ingredients, the peppers that you like or different things that you'll go to. So same thing with herbs. If you want something sweet, you might add mint. If you want spicy, you might look for like a spicy oregano. If you want like something acidic, you could do like lemon balm. So kind of knowing if that herb is going to have like one of those flavor profiles and then pulling that in. Another thing to keep in mind is how you'll be cooking the herbs. So the best example is basil. I brought some samples of different herbs, and I brought no basil because no basil survived the frost from the last few days. So if you're cooking with something that's going to be like really sensitive, like basil or parsley or cilantro, I'll save those and add those at the very end of cooking so they won't actually get exposed to heat. Or I'll add it to something that's already been cooked, just sprinkle it on top, where like rosemary and thyme and sage, they can hold up to heat a little bit better because they're a little bit more sturdier plants. So for example, anything that can survive in like the hot climates outside is probably going to survive in the hot oven or on the hot stove top. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Because I don't know if any of you use basil on stuff, but it'll like, say you put it on some pizza, at the end of it, after you pull it out of the oven, it'll turn black after like a minute or two on the pizza. So it doesn't look very pretty. So let's keep that in mind too. If you put it in a sauce and you're going to be cooking it, it might not look that great. Where if you did sage, I mean, there's tons of recipes where all you do is fry sage first and then you use the sage later. So kind of what kind of plant would hold up to what cooking methods. But yeah. Another reason I like herbs is the color. So especially like if you think of a caprese salad. So for Christmas, I always make caprese salads, which sounds really weird. But you have your red tomatoes, you have your white mozzarella cheese, and then you'll have your green basil leaves. So you have like a nice red and green dish That's a little bit on the lighter side, so that's why I like to have it. But yeah, so thinking of what kind of color those herbs are going to bring in. So sprinkling like parsley on top of different things, especially if it's like, say, a cube steak with like onions and mushroom. It's kind of that like bland, brownish, tannish color. So you want to get a pop of color. So herbs are easy to do that with, and they'll add green to just about anything. Or you'll see people with tacos. They'll put like cilantro on the tacos for a pop of green, or like the chives or something. Yeah. And then last but definitely not least are the health benefits. So I mentioned that herbs will help replace some of the salt in your dishes because it'll have that flavor cover up, but there's also a ton of other health benefits. So all the herbs, I mean, they're all plants. They're all essentially vegetables. So they're all going to be high in vitamins and minerals. They all have phytochemicals, which are good for all of us. And then some of them are actually anti-inflammatory and or antibacterial too. So those are both good benefits for everybody.
Which ones are anti-inflammatory?
Let me see if my next slide lists a few. I listed a few different herbs and some of them that we know more research about. I don't think I wrote any of the anti-inflammatory ones up there though. Oh yeah, turmeric. Oh yeah, definitely. Turmeric is a huge one right now that's anti-inflammatory. People will add it to things that they're making at home or take a supplement for the anti-inflammatory compounds. Thank you. But yeah, so there's just a few of them. So you can have some notes on what they do. But honestly, there's no downside to any of these. They're just going to add flavor and they're going to add all their health benefits. There's not a ton of research on all the benefits of herbs because there's no like Basil Corporation out there that's like paying millions of dollars for a study to be done. But it's just like anything else, just like carrots, just like broccoli, just like kale. It's going to be good for you in one way, shape, or form. So it's kind of a, you know, what's the harm in just adding some, especially if it's going to taste better. That's kind of my philosophy. All right. And then outside of the kitchen, there are some other benefits. So I listed some of the other uses for the herbs that you can use around the house. So the first one's floral arrangements, and that's what I have in this picture. So you can see it looks like a floral arrangement. You wouldn't expect there to be herbs in it, but you can see there's actually some little lavender, like lavender sprigs, and then they have some mint flowing out of there too. So you can work these different herbs into different floral arrangements around the house too. And then another great benefits of herbs is the pollinators. Has anybody been following like the issue with the honeybees and pollination, or like the monarch butterflies? Okay, so anything where we can get more pollinators is a good thing. So there's some herbs that are definitely higher than others in terms of pollinators, depending on what flowers they have and if the bees or the monarch butterflies like those flowers. But they're all good. So I don't, unless I'm going to save the flowers, I try not to cut them off until I think the plant needs it. But yeah. Landscaping is another benefit. So like I mentioned, the rosemary out there or lavender, just you can put it in your landscape as a perennial, just like you would an azalea or a hydrangea. It's just kind of knowing what that plant's going to look like, you know, in the spring, in the summer, in the fall, and then is it evergreen in the winter, or is it going to be just kind of like stalks in the winter? Then you can also do gifts. I remember when I went to like stay at a friend's house, she had like her little like towel out in the guest bedroom for me, and then on top of it she had tied like lavender, dried lavender, and just like put a little bow on it and tied it on the towel. And I was like, oh, this is so cute. I feel like I'm at like a bed and breakfast or something. But I was just staying at a friend's house. And then essential oils, what I mentioned earlier with the oil infusers, you can use your herbs to infuse the oils too. Yeah. And then I included a couple resources. So most of the information I got for this presentation either came from the Clemson Extension Office or the University of Georgia Extension Office. Those are two that I really like. I always like to warn people, especially from nutrition perspective, you can learn a lot online, which is a good thing, but not all of it's true, which is a bad thing. So if I'm looking for actual plan information, I tend to look for an extension office website, just because it's run by a university. They're not going to put anything on there unless there's actual research behind it, which no other websites are really like that's not going to stop them. If you go to like howtogrowherbs.com, they're not like, oh, there's no research on that, we can't publish that on our website. Where the Clemson and UGA and any university website, that's going to be a hard stop for them. Yeah.